Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session. I'm so excited about this conversation with Bill and John. Thank you for joining us. These two men are foundational to environmental journalism. Bill McKibben, who's joining us from the United States. He's an author, an environmentalist, and an activist. In 1988, he wrote one of the first major books on climate change called The End of Nature, and he's just been writing ever since. He's the co-founder of 350.org, an international climate campaign that's all over the world. And he recently launched a very amazing newsletter for The New Yorker called The Climate Crisis. And John Vidal, we have here, he served as the environment editor of The Guardian for 27 years and really laid the work as that section becoming one of the best environmental sections in the world. He's reported from more than 100 countries. He has also written a book called McLibel, Burger on Trial, and now he continues writing after he retired from The Guardian in 2016. So welcome to both of you so much, and thank you for joining. So I'm just going to jump right into the state of things right now. We have major uprisings in the United States. We have COVID-19, we have climate change and the climate crisis. How do you see the media, the international media, giving space to these three crises at once? And is it doing an okay job of this? And I'll direct that at you, John.
Wow. It's kind of make it up as you go along. There is so much happening at the moment that news desks are completely overblown. I mean, they've got so much on the health stuff, on the COVID. They've got American stuff. They've got, I mean, worldwide, there is now a sort of an enormous explosion of news. And it's very, very difficult for anyone to cover it. I mean, all you can do is you can concentrate on each individual thing, on each individual area, and you can go for that. And I think, actually the newspapers are doing very, very well indeed. The governments are not. The governments are clearly in a right old mess. And the newspapers, certainly the ones I've seen from America and in Europe, they're really on the case. And so I think they're going to come out of it very well indeed. But I fear that governments will not, because it's a right mess at the moment. And that's what journalism's for. It is really to uncover the mess and to hold those, the governments and the decision makers to hold their feet to the fire. And I think that's what's happening now. So I think, the fourth estate, the media, is doing a brilliant job. And I just want to say, actually, that on the climate thing, I mean, it's gone away a little bit, but actually the media has been brilliant. If you think about it, in 20, 30 years, it has changed the world. It's changed how the world sees nature. It's changed how the world reports on about very, very few people. Bill is my great hero because he broke out of the ordinary mainstream journalism and became an activist. I was far too shy to become an activist. I never did. I just hid behind my the Guardian or whatever, and encouraged other people to do it. But Bill had actually been out there and put himself on the line time and time again. Environment reporters like me have basically just stacked up the air miles. We've just traveled around and seen what's going on, and we've acted as the witnesses. Bill has done the hard work. He's persuaded everybody. We've just presented the information, and Bill has run with it. So it's a fantastic job. It's two different ones: the activist and the if you like, the reporter. But they complement.
Well, let me return the compliment a little bit, because it strikes me that the most important part in a lot of ways of the climate change saga in the media has been about figuring out how to tell a story about something that for a very long time was invisible. Stories are how human beings understand the world. Yes, it's very important to have science and data and reports and so on and so forth, but we really understand the world through stories. And one of the great conundrums of climate change early on was we knew that something very terrible was coming our way, but it hadn't gotten here yet quite, so it was difficult to know exactly how to tell that story. The deeper conundrum that we should also talk about was, we had a trillion-dollar industry whose business model depended on us not taking climate change seriously, so that got in the way, and they mounted a huge disinformation campaign. But I remember very well when John set out around the world to do the first set of stories, with a farmer in Kenya, just continent after continent, country after country, really documenting in human terms for the first time that climate change was taking a deep personal human toll. And that was a really, really important accomplishment. Journalism didn't distinguish itself around climate change for the first 15 or so years of this saga. Too much of journalism treated it as a both sides story and, a matter for debate. They fell precisely into the trap that the oil companies and their PR firms had set. But John's absolutely right. Following his lead in a lot of ways, journalists have become tremendous at covering this in the last few years. And if you read the Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian or the European papers on a regular basis, even the wire services, Reuters, whatever, you now understand precisely the urgency of the situation that we're in. But it remains to be, the stories remain to be told. And as Gabriel, your original question implies, they remain to be told in the context of these, kind of evolving crises that we've set ourselves up for. It's not as if these are disparate things that aren't linked together. I mean, I was writing for the New Yorker today about the uprisings here in this country. And remember, they were started by a cop kneeling on the neck of a black man while he yelled, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." Well, I can't breathe is what people say and think in huge swaths of the world because there's a coal-fired power plant next to them. Because in Delhi, the air has gotten so bad that 2.5 million out of 5 million children have irreversible lung damage just from breathing the air outside. These stories are profoundly related. We're in a crisis of legitimacy and authority, and in a crisis of survival now in very deep ways. And so it will take all the tools that we have, including the tools of great journalists and storytellers, to be able to get us through this, I think.
Mm-hmm. Bill, did you feel that it was, to start with, there's 10, 15 years after the Rio summit and whatever, it became very sciencey, and it was all about parts per billion. It was very hard to break out of that. The scientists it had to be backed up by science, but we weren't getting those human stories. We weren't making the links between food and environmental climate and air pollution, or air pollution and health and things like that. And I think what's happened in the last 4 or 5 years is that it's all coming together. And now it's a social justice movement now as much as anything. It's a movement for change and for good change. And I think that's the exciting. The danger is that we as journalists anyway, is that we become too much the advocate and we don't keep the distance between the if you like, we get too close to the people who we think are going to be doing well or whatever, and we don't really hold up the environment groups, the conservation groups, and all kinds of other people who are really sort of doing wrong. So I just fear there's a danger that we become environment journalists rather than just journalists. We should now, it's not a speciality anymore. It is now everything. Everything is environment. Everything is social. Everything is scientific. So we can really understand nature in a much broader, more interesting way.
Well, that's a really interesting point. I do think, though, that there's also room for real crusading journalism too. Your old boss, Alan Rusbridger, who I think is the great newspaper editor of the 21st century, in many ways. Rusbridger put together this remarkable campaign that The Guardian helped run for divestment from fossil fuel companies. And that was a really integral part of the fact that half the universities in the UK have now divested from fossil fuel. This has become one of the signal campaigns of this era. So I do think that there's plenty of room for it, when you're in a crisis of survival, for all the institutions in our societies to join in. But it doesn't diminish. In fact, it probably increases the need for being really good reporters. I've kept on doing journalism all these years, not beat journalism. I'm an activist too, so I can't go write, the kind of cover the beat, but I can continue to write and produce stories that help, illuminate things. And I don't think that there's a huge contradiction there, any more than there is, I suppose, in great war reporting, or something like that. I mean, we're now in a war, in this case, happily not a war with each other. In the best case, a war of all of us together trying to take on an extraordinary problem. But that's a different kind of journalism.
I agree. I mean, one of the problems for me is that climate has become almost all-encompassing, and so you now have climate desks, whereas before you'd have an environment desk which covered everything, and sort of a very sort of broad range of stuff. You now have a climate desk, and you may have 5 or 6 climate reporters on the New York Times or wherever. And this seems to me completely bonkers, because it's really, it all makes up climate, but by narrowing it down, even linguistically, just to climate, you're avoiding issues like, I don't know, air pollution, say, or the impact of food, or there's so many different things which don't get covered now because they all have to fit into, what some editor thinks is the climate agenda, and I think that's a little bit dangerous. I think we should be broadening out, but for that we need to be educated and to understand the links between all of these different things. At that point you can. But I think the word climate, I think the environment movement itself is really wacky when it comes to language. I mean, it chooses words which nobody understands. I mean, what's biodiversity? What the hell? What sort of word is that? What sort of word is environment? I mean, it's sustainability. I mean, it's all completely. It's not meant. You're not meant to understand it. So I think our role is to reveal. And Bill has got the. I don't know whoever's out there listening. Bill is probably the best writer about climate we've had in 30 years. I mean, if I could have commissioned him every week, I bloody well would have. I mean, he's absolutely superb. But it's now an act of communication. It's not so much an act of partaking science or translating what other, more academic people know. It's now about communicating. And one good communicator, one great writer can say more in 1,000 words than 100 science writers or whatever, or people who are narrow. So we need people who understand the arts, the philosophy, the science, the links between things. I think Bill has brilliantly captured that.
John is, I think, very right. And Gabby, you may want to jump in here too, but John, I think, is very right about that. One of the things that's interesting about climate change is we initially perceived it as a kind of issue, like, gun violence or, budget deficits or something to, have on a list of issues. It's possible that it's better understood as a kind of frame, a lens through which to look at the world. If you ask me, the story that we told for the last 50 or 75 years, the basic lens through which we looked at the world, the question that we asked over and over again was, will this cause the economy to grow faster or not? That was the question our politicians were asking, and hence journalism and everything else was kind of asking. And if the answer to the question about anything was, yes, this will cause the economy to get larger, then we generally did it. And, with some good results and some bad results. The economy got much larger. Think that the lens through which we're going to look at things now for a while may, and this goes, with COVID and goes with the uprisings in the US. And I mean, the lens through which we're going to be looking at things for a while is survival. Does this increase our chances for surviving or not? Because for the first time, we're really in a scenario where it's not to be taken for granted, the survival of our civilizations. You know, if you read and follow the climate science, the scale of trouble that we're now wandering into is unlike anything that our species has dealt with in the past. And I think one way to think about what's going on with COVID right now is as well. I mean, it's a kind of early iteration of the crises that are going to dominate much of this century. The idea that we're somehow going to go back to normal seems folly to me, because the perch where we now stand is so precarious that there are going to be a series of events. Some of them will be global, like COVID, and many of them will be confined to a particular continent or even a particular city when a huge storm or a drought or a heat wave or something. But we're in a time of testing from now on, going forward. And it's not at all clear how the results of that test come out. And that's going to be very unsettling for our systems, including our journalistic systems, which so far have been geared to the idea that, you know, everything gets, you know, the basic human story is progress and advancement and so on.
Come back to COVID, because I find it absolutely fascinating. And I have to say that I got it wrong. I had not really looked at in all these years of writing about stuff, I had not really looked at ecological health and human health together. I'd understood quite a lot about climate change and health and the potential things to go horribly wrong there, but I hadn't got the relationship with animals and our health. And I think this is really fundamental stuff, because it feeds into the food program, it feeds into the food systems and factory farming, into how we treat forests and how we look after biodiversity. The idea that a healthy planet is absolutely fundamental to human health as well is a very important, significant change in the way we see the world. We've separated all these things out. And I think this is a great coming together. We're beginning to understand now, I'm beginning to understand, that it really is important, and that the health writers have to be environment writers, and their environment writers have to be hooked into all kinds of different stuff. Some of the ecology coming out of American universities is fascinating. The whole, oh boy, I mean, I'm not going to write a book, but if ever there were a book to be written, it's about this. It's about how we did not understand when we were in the forest that actually we were making our own. When we were cutting down the forests, that we were actually cutting down ourselves as well. And that for me is one of the great lessons of COVID. And if our politicians and if our NGOs and if everybody understands that, just that, it can change potentially everything. It changes the way we develop as in cities. It changes the way we give foreign aid. I mean, 100 different things it potentially changes. And so that for me has been one of the most brilliant things. The science community has actually come out with this new stuff and told us, yes, there is a great link between human health and with planetary health. Well, that is so exciting for me.
COVID, in general, the sense of well, it strikes me that there's a couple of powerful lessons that we're learning subconsciously more than consciously that are very useful. One of them just is that reality is real, you know. We live in a world of screens and you know, where everything seems adaptable and mutable and shiftable. But as I've been trying to argue for people for 3 decades now, you can't actually force physics and chemistry to compromise or negotiate. And the COVID microbe makes the same argument for biology. I mean, you know, it doesn't matter what Donald Trump or Boris Johnson wanted to do, you know, if it says wear a mask, wear a mask, you know. The corollary to that, of course, and it's important for climate as well as other things, is a dawning understanding that speed really matters. You know, the countries that flattened their carbon curve fast came out ahead. The countries like ours that delayed and dithered came out at the other end of things. And I mean, that's a pretty perfect analog for how we've dealt with the climate crisis. The third one, and I think this is really important in the end, is just a powerful reminder that social solidarity really matters. The Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan view of the world, that markets were going to solve all problems, that there was no such thing as society, there were only individual men and women, and so on and so forth. That's kind of dominated our political life. John, you'll recall that it was, Gabby, you're too young, but Ronald Reagan, his favorite laugh line in all his speeches was, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, ha, ha, ha. It turns out the scary words in the English language are, we've run out of ventilators, or the hillside behind your house is on fire now. And you can't solve those one person.
Bill, I find it
Gabby, we've been
the idea that it should be some microscopic microbe, something which no one can actually see, which is the greatest security threat of the last 100 years, which has actually changed governments, changed economies, changed livelihoods, changed everything, is something which we cannot see, but yet has come out of nature, which we haven't respected because we have not respected it. And it's such a fundamental lesson. I mean, how can you spend $200 billion a year on nuclear missiles or whatever it is, and absolutely nothing on animal health or on planetary health? I mean, that is, to me, this is where you as a climate writer, me as a different sort of writer, as so many other news essays, this is one of the areas we can go down, is to really drive that wedge in between the lack of understanding of the environment and governments and people in knowledge. And we now know there are different priorities, and it's fantastic. So I think we should be very positive about COVID. We've also seen, we can imagine now, I mean, certainly in Wales, I don't know about you here, we can imagine a better world. We can imagine a world with fewer cars. We can imagine a world without air pollution. We can imagine a world where people are quieter, where it's not so crazy and people are moving so fast. It's like, it's a much more, it gives a sense of possibility. Now, most of that will go when everything unlocks itself and so on and so forth, but it will stay with people. I think that idea that change was possible, that we could all live in a different way, even if it wasn't for the best of reasons, but we could all do it if we wanted to. There's been no litter here. There's been no sort of huge influx of crazy tourists. It's been a sort of a very revelatory, calm, peaceful time for many, many people. Obviously, for some, it's been horrid. I completely understand. But for an awful lot of people, we could see for the first time what cities could be like. We could see what we could do for ourselves. I think I'm sort of positive.
No silver linings in a pandemic, but perhaps some lessons learned. Gabrielle, we've been rattling on here. At least I have mostly. What are you thinking about some of this stuff, and where would you like to steer this conversation a little?
No, it's been fantastic to hear you two talk to each other about all of your experience, which amounts to much more than mine. But one thing that popped into my head as you guys were talking was the interweaving of so many different thoughts and so many different sectors, and seeing all of them through the lens of climate. And I think I was talking to a linguist earlier this morning as part of this conference, and he was talking about language and how sustainability and profitability are sometimes lumped together. And so we look for the profitability when we're seeking to be sustainable as well. And he didn't necessarily always think that was a good thing. But now I'm thinking about that in terms of climate and seeing things through the lens of climate. What other things do you think should be lumped into climate? You're talking about health, planetary health, animal health, human health. How do you want the media to lump more things into this one lens?
Well, one of the things that I think is very, very promising and good development is that there are now a large number of business and finance reporters who are covering climate change as their main topic. And they should be, because among other things, this is the most important economic story of our time. There's, on the one hand, extraordinary economic damage coming if we don't deal with climate change. Like on a scale, the last numbers I saw were by the end of the century, full-on climate change, the guess on the economic toll was $551 trillion, which is more money than currently exists on planet Earth, you know. And on the other hand, you know, this is the energy transition that we have to make, the retrofitting of buildings, the building of wind turbines and solar panels and so on. I mean, this is clearly the one thing that could drive our economies coming out of the depression that we seem to have lowered ourselves into here with COVID. So I'm very glad to see that, in particular to see the constant attention, and I think the divestment campaign had a fair amount to do with this, on banks and asset managers and things that are propping up the fossil fuel industry. It remains worth saying all the time that the biggest reason we're in the mess we're in, the reason we've done so little, is that the richest industry in the world, when we began this saga, the fossil fuel industry, made it its business to make sure we wouldn't do anything about that. Great investigative reporting has uncovered the fact that these oil companies knew everything there was to know about the climate mess, you know, decades ago, and just straight up lied about it year after year after year. So I'm very glad to see that story being told, and very grateful for our colleagues in business journalism, who I think are suddenly, in the last 2 or 3 years, doing a just terrific job of telling that story.
No, I agree completely. I think it's been again, I'm slightly hesitant. I just feel that there's huge money now coming into, if you like, green energy, into biodiversity. There's you know, the if you like, the environment. There's never been more money in the environment now, and therefore there's probably never been more corruption. There's probably never been more manipulation by governments or whatever, or politicizing or agenda setting. So I think, you know, we as writers have to be, you know, although we can celebrate a lot of the stuff, and it's fantastic, you know, what the business guys are doing, but at the same time, we have to be there pointing out, because we know the subject pretty well, pointing out that how the corruption which goes into so many of these different aspects of the green economy as well.
Amen to that.
Yeah, no, it's something. I mean, I'm when I've been on the beat for quite a while, and so you kind of know where the bodies are hidden, and a lot of business reporters and people come and say, John, where's the big, you know, financial story in the environment? And you point them to, you know, all kinds of different things. It's that because you know that's something which you haven't been able to cover yourself for, but you know that there are stones to be overturned or upturned all over the place here. So we've got to be sort of ultra careful now. That I do think the environment is winning. I think that we are entering a completely different age. I think I think that every government has got it. It doesn't want to change it. A lot of businesses have got it. And over the period of the next 20 years, when you consider how far it's come since, I don't know, that Rio meeting or I mean, just 10 years, it's phenomenal. I'd go ahead another 10 years, 20 years, and you begin to have, you know, you can see real change. That's the
place to leave this. That's the place to leave this. We're in a race, and that race is a race between how quickly we can rejigger the world around us and how fast physics and chemistry are going to raise the temperature of the planet. And the outcome of that race is the most fateful story that humans have ever witnessed or ever will witness. And such credit to John for being one of the very first people to understand that as the drama that it was, and to begin the task of digging out the stories that lay beneath it. Those stories are easy to find now that we live in an era of epic heat waves and, massive droughts and hideous floods. Those stories are easy to find, but they weren't easy to find when John started doing this work. And I remember reading those early stories and being spectacularly grateful for that coverage. So,
well, Bill, I'll add one tiny. Sorry, Bill. I'll add one tiny thing. It's I'm not a science writer. I was never trained in science, but I've often found that the best storytelling comes from people who covered the arts, people who covered culture, people who have covered human rights and totally different. That science has to be the base, but the storytelling depends on culture, and therefore we should encourage that at every point.
Absolutely. Friends, I have to say goodbye, but what a pleasure to get to talk with you. And Gabrielle, thanks for your work here, and everybody else's. What an excellent conference. And John, I'll look forward to seeing you at some point when we're back on the move, maybe someday.
I hope so. Thanks, Bill.
Take care.
Bill, thank you so much for joining us. And John, thank you for agreeing to stay on to answer some questions from the audience. I'll just say really quickly that Bill McKibben has a newsletter from the New Yorker that you should all sign up for called The Climate Crisis. But John, it's great to have you for some questions. Thank you for keeping the time. And I will, we'll take some from the audience in just a second, but I have one of my own that I've been dying to ask you that touches on something Bill left us with, but your work at The Guardian, and when you began the environment section there, I believe you had pitched the idea to an editor for a section about the environment, and then 2 years later, he came back to you and said he wanted the first story within a matter of weeks or something crazy like that. But you really had such foresight to create that section, and then there was a bit of the paper to catch up to you, but what was that like?
Gabrielle, thank you so much. It was exactly like that. We had the idea that The Guardian, as a great liberal paper, should be listening to these new debates which were coming out of science, out of NGOs, out of the environment movement and whatever, and that nobody was putting them into the mainstream press, that nobody was really looking more broadly at it. And I went to see the editor of the paper at that time, and he said, "John, fantastic idea. We've got no money at all, so we won't do it." And I thought, okay. So I went back to a very nice job, actually writing about theatre and film and literature and whatever. And 2 years later, in 1989, he came up and said, "Do you remember that stuff about the environment?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Right, your idea, you do it." I said, No, it's just an idea. It wouldn't be, I shouldn't do it." He said, "No, you do it. You start in 2 weeks' time." And so we were all out of our depth, absolutely out of our depth. But then various, you grow. We the journalists are being educated all the time by our readers, by scientists, by politicians, by people who've got more knowledge than us. Our job is just to listen and to act as a sort of vector, to interpret, and in some cases to make more clear what other people who know much more about things than we do. And over time, we build it up, and happily, The Guardian was very generous in the sense that it just let us go and it paid little attention to us. And it was only when it went digital in about 2005, 6, that sort of time, that we understood that this was a global issue, one of the great global issues, and therefore we should really sort of immerse ourselves in it and run it as far and see ourselves not as an American or French or European or Australian, but see ourselves as a global disseminator and interpreter, an advocate in the environment. And I left 2 years ago, but I'm still doing stuff. But it's going really well. I mean, there's a huge amount of stuff coming out every day now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really set the foundation for other papers and media all across the world. And did you ever expect to spend nearly 3 decades reporting on the environment? How did that change your life?
I always say I've never written the same story twice. I mean, it's such a vast area now. There's nothing which it doesn't. The only thing I have not written about, which I want to write about, has been cricket and the environment. Cricket is a funny English game which is played in a sort of over 4 or 5 days, and nobody understands it and whatever. And it absolutely depends on the environment. It depends, the way you spin the ball, the moisture in the pitch, everything changes. So sport and the environment have not really taken off as a great sort of sub-subject, but they will at some point. But apart from anything, I think I've written, everything. But there's no area which we haven't really looked at in some way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope some sports journalists are listening, because this will make for some great news stories. All sports. It's football. It's American football as well. You can't, were temperatures to rise that much more, you can't play sport in the middle of the day. You have to think of different times. That means you have to change the rules. You might have to. There's all kind of, if there's too much rain or whatever, you have to abandon stuff. The way you throw a ball when it's raining is very different. So when you throw a ball when it's very hot and dry, it's just, environment is in everything. Nature is in absolutely everything. So it's so exciting, and I love it when people think of a completely different idea to write about. It's very good. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, that's just another example of how it's so all-encompassing. I'm going to turn to a question from Joost van Heiningen now from Wageningen University. I hope I didn't mispronounce his name too badly. But he's asking something that I'm sure you've come across over the course of your career plenty of times, which is, when you're talking to climate deniers, how do you have an open and flowing conversation with them without devolving into complete polarization and debate?
I love them. I love them. I think it's like the sort of, it's like flat Earth stuff now. No, I respect them. I think that's number one, because every science, every area needs checks and balances. We need people to say, no, you haven't got that right. Scientists need people to disagree. We need people in the social movements to say, no, that's not right. It has to be a debate. And science eventually works out as a consensus, a sort of consensus. And that's what the environment debate is, becoming a consensus. But it does need people to question, to interrogate us as well. So when you get the climate deniers, some of them are completely bonkers, and you can treat them with great fun. But I think you treat them with respect and listen to them. And if when and if, I always say, when and if they come up with the science, and when they come up with the evidence of what they're saying, then we will report it accurately and well. But until they do, it's just hot air. It's nothing. So you can't do. I've had more fun with climate. The devil always has the best tunes, and climate deniers are very funny people. They really are. They take themselves very seriously, and it's good to have a great laugh with them. But I don't want to write about them particularly, because it's not fair. But anyway, they write it. They're completely mad about us as well. So it's become a bit of a cultural issue, though, sort of them and us. And so I think we learn to disagree. And but when they have the evidence, then I will write about it. And if the IPCC has got it all wrong, then we will say that. It's not a question of if. It's when they make mistakes, then we should be absolutely on there. And, yeah, so I hope that's.
Thank you. This is a question from a journalist, and I'm gonna weave in another question as well. This is Gloria Payar. She's coming from Barcelona. And she's asking how to pitch cross-cutting stories to desks that are often siloed in relation to the environment. So kind of what we were getting in before, like the environment in sports or the environment in arts. How do you pitch that?
It's hard. It's hard. It is hard. It's hard. Editors really only like the obvious stories. They don't want to get mixed up and muddled and whatever. I think it's just through persuasion, and if someone doesn't like it, go somewhere else. If they don't want it, then don't. Or the other way is to pitch it a little bit more mainstream, and then to use the story as a stepping board to getting in these cross-cutting issues. But it is a problem. It really is. And that's just the nature of journalism. That's nothing to do with the subject. I mean, I think what we're finding out is that all of these subjects are cross-cutting. If only it was as simple as there was one thing called climate, or one thing called air, or one thing called, they're all mixed up and muddled up. So we have to just accept that we need a new form of writing to explain these difficult issues. You can't say it all in 500 words of a news story. Maybe you have to think differently about how you write, about maybe the length which you write, or the style in which you write it. You have to be endlessly inventive to get round the editors. But usually there's more than one editor. Wait till the one's having a day off and then go to the other one. Sort of, if mum doesn't like it, dad might. I mean, just keep at it. I think that's the main thing. Stickability. Just keep going.
Mm-hmm. The pillar of journalism.
Go to the Guardian. Go to the Guardian. I mean, as simple as that.
So this question comes from Hira Suman Kazim. I'm not sure where he or she is coming from, but they're asking, in developing countries with weak law implementation, how can we use journalism and storytelling to make corporations take the environment more seriously? Is it holding them accountable, or is it through means of persuasion? Or how do you see journalism playing a role there?
In developing countries, it can be very difficult. Journalism is tremendously under-resourced and obsessed with one or two things, like the politics or the corruption or whatever it might be. So it's very, very, very difficult to get stuff in this way. I don't know. One of the best ways actually is not to, if you can't get the story into I don't know, an African paper, go to a paper which covers Africa from outside, like the Guardian, like the New York Times, like whoever it is. If they print it, it gives the editors in Kinshasa or wherever it might be suddenly take it seriously. Oh, this is really interesting. We didn't know about the peat forests of Congo. We didn't know about the droughts and wherever it was. And so sometimes it takes the people far away to be able to put something on the agenda in those countries. That's not always possible. But again, I think the other thing is that journalism now is, there are so many more opportunities to put things out onto the web in different ways. And so we've got blog spots, we've got websites, we've got NGOs, in a way, we don't need the mainstream press as we used to. I mean, I've got a 5,000 word story and I don't know where to put it at the moment, but I'm just going to print it. I don't care. I mean, I won't get any money, but I just want it out there. And I think if we want it out there, and you'd be surprised how many journalists sort of follow bloggers and other, just because sometimes they can be the first sense. They can give you a clue about where a story suitable for their publication is. So these things do get written, do get read, and it's just, if in doubt, just publish.
Absolutely. I'll end on one last question. Could you describe a story in your reporting career that was most pivotal to you as a storyteller?
Well, plenty, but okay. 2009, you had the huge Copenhagen climate conference. And it really was big, and all the governments, all the celebrities, absolutely everybody was going to be there. There were 20,000-30,000 NGOs. There were every government in the world, massive demonstrations. And so what we did, we realized right from the start that instead of just following the American government or the British government, we should follow the poorer countries, the developing countries, because the United Nations works on consensus. It doesn't work as one big bully tells them what to do. So we went to Africa, we went absolutely all over the world, making contacts with people, finding out from their point of view, from the Peruvian point of view, from the Venezuelan point of view, from the Brazilian, Indonesia, what was going on. So by the time that conference opened, in December 2009, we had probably the best range of contacts in the whole of that sort of area. And it became very, very clear right from the start that this wasn't going to work. And I remember I got a leak. It was told to me that if I went to this particular office at a particular time, I would meet a certain person and they would give me something which would blah, 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 blah. And so I went there, and we went inside one office, and the man said, no, come with me. We went into a broom cupboard at the back. And I said, why are we in a broom cupboard? And he pointed up because the Americans are listening. And they had all their listening devices, because you realize very quickly that climate has actually got nothing to do with climate. It's got everything to do with money and geopolitics and whatever. Anyway, so we're in the back of a broom cupboard, and he says to me, I've got this paper. Hang on, what's that? You couldn't read it, so I had to have a torch. And it was a Chinese interpretation of what governments were planning to do. Now, we didn't even know about the plans. We didn't understand the Chinese and whatever. I said, you're going to have to explain it. So he said, well, come back tomorrow and we'll give you the other paper, the big paper. So he came back tomorrow, and it was called the Danish text. And basically, it was the most corrupt thing in the world. It was about six or eight big governments were stitching up everybody in the world, and were going to muscle through this agreement, which would have had an agreement, which was so deleterious, it was so awful for most of the world, and would not have reduced emissions very much at all, and was basically unfair, unjust, and wrong. And no other governments knew about it. So we put it into the Guardian, and the whole conference fell apart. It was fantastic in a sense. It stopped there being a coup d'etat when it comes to the environment, but at the same time it delayed there being a true consensus until Paris 7 years later on. And but it was a very interesting thing where you can where especially diplomats began to trust us because we had listened to them. If we hadn't listened, they came to the Guardian because we took the trouble to listen to them. You're not going to go to some paper or news channel which hasn't bothered at all. So it's the first law of journalism is make friends with the people who are going to give you the stuff which you absolutely need. And that was, for me, that was brilliant, because it was, the whole thing then became a very, very great debate about equity and the United Nations and consensus and everything like that. And out of it has come something much better. But it did take journalism, I always feel, it took journalism to blow it apart. And I saw our Prime Minister halfway through the conference, and he was absolutely furious. I'm sorry, it was the Environment Secretary. He was absolutely furious. He said, "How dare you do this? You should never have needed." He expected us, the newspapers, to sit quiet on this out of national security. I mean, it was insane. So that was a good one, but there were much more fun ones as well.
Well, now we know that Copenhagen was
fun. Up. Yeah, check out Daily Text and Guardian. I'll tell you. No, after that, the Guardian was pretty worried because all the establishment, all the British establishment, got very, very angry because they had pinned enormous hopes and political commitment into their stitch up. And so they got the Guardian to do an inquiry into how we conducted ourselves at the conference. And they went to they brought an independent person in, and he went to all the big establishment figures, and half of them said, no, the Guardian was absolutely dreadful. I said, how dare they do that? They should never have touched it, whatever. And another lot said, no, it was very, very, very good. But the interesting thing is they said that the British establishment and the Americans, because they went to the Americans, said that we were totally irresponsible because we gave more space to the developing countries. In other words, most of the world. I mean, it was the most elitist, shameful episode I've seen in many, many years of journalism.
Gosh, what a story.
So we got away with it.
You got away with it, and for a good reason. Thank you so much, John, for taking the time and for sharing.
It's my absolute. I wish I could see you all, but I can't. There you go. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Look forward to reading your 5,000.
Well, and good luck with this conference, because the relationship between food and the environment is absolutely key to the whole thing. And I think that's what we're realizing with COVID, to bring it right back up to date. You know, COVID is an environment story. It's an ecological story, as much as it is anything else. And it's the way we farm. It's the way we understand animal disease and human disease and whatever. So it came out of the environment, this nasty little, virus. But we've just got to be aware there are going to be many, many more out there, because they're all human induced. I mean, we are responsible for the diseases which we get. But anyway, thank you so much indeed. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Okay, bye.
Bye.